Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we're talking about rising gun violence and how to talk to your kids about their fears. Joining us is Dr. Abena Brown El Hill Ali, licensed clinical psychologist with Kennedy Krieger's Institute for Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress. Dr. Brown El Hill Ali, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Janet, for having me.
To our viewers and listeners, this episode is pre-recorded, but feel free to reach out and leave any comments or questions that you have, and we'll get back to you. Let's get started. So first, I just wanted to talk about the problem itself. So what is going on with gun violence this year, and how does it compare to previous years? What are the trends that are happening right now?
So both for 2021 and for 2020, the statistics are showing a sharp increase in gun violence all over the country. And there are a couple of different reasons why the statisticians believe this is happening. And one of the main reasons is the pandemic and everything that's happened as a result of the pandemic. As you probably know, because of your own experiences, that society as a whole is undergoing a whole lot of stress right now related to the pandemic, related to things being shut down, lots of people out of work, and then the inequalities that the pandemic have uncovered and exacerbated. So in addition to how we're being directly impacted by the pandemic, all of those safe and adaptive coping measures that we had, like going to church regularly, or for children to have access to their youth programs, those are no longer accessible, or they are in high demand or functioning at a lower or limited level. And that really takes away our ways of figuring out how to deal with stress. And along with that comes, and unfortunately, sometimes violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we're seeing then an increase due to COVID and some of that playing out from what's been going on. Are you seeing this in sort of fears of this in a lot of your clients, or are you seeing it within certain population or areas more than others?
Mm-hmm. Well, for sure, different populations and different groups of people have been directly impacted by violence, particularly in their communities, and particularly in communities where we are more densely populated. And it's not that gun violence isn't happening everywhere, because gun violence definitely happens wherever guns are. There's the possibility of gun violence. However, in a more densely populated area, the probability of having these unfortunate incidents occur tend to be higher. And when we look at the statistics, we do see more incidents of gun violence in more populated areas. So in my particular line of work, I do see families that are coming from the more densely populated areas, families that are coming from rural and suburban areas as well. And families from all of these areas have their own share of experiences with gun violence. It just depends on their particular experiences and what's happening to them at that time.
Mm-hmm. I think that was something I was really, surprised by. It makes sense that there's going to be some gun violence in cities simply because, as you said, there's a larger population. So the numbers are going to be higher because there are more people there. But I was particularly surprised how much of an increase there was even in the rural areas. And I think, as you said, wherever there are guns, there will be gun violence. And I think that's important for everyone to remember that this does impact everyone, everywhere. How aware are our children of this increase in gun violence right now?
I would say some children are completely oblivious to it. And that's simply because there's just no reason for them to be aware of it. Mm-hmm. They are not being exposed to it through media coverage. They're not being exposed to it directly in their families or in their community. And then on the other hand, there's some children who are very much aware of it because it has impacted them directly. There are teens that we work with who have been directly impacted by violence, by gun violence and have lost friends and loved ones or multiple friends and loved ones. And so unfortunately, it's very familiar for them. And then at the same time, they're children of the same age who probably are completely oblivious to the fact that gun violence has increased significantly in the past 2 years. So it really just depends on the child's exposure and exactly what their particular individual situations are.
Hmm. So then as parents or even educators, what should we do when we're talking to kids about gun violence, or even when you're thinking about these kids with a variety, a huge continuum of exposure? Should we try to protect our kids as much as possible and not discuss it? Either end of the spectrum. If you have kids who had a high exposure, or children who have no idea what's going on, as you said, or should we be really open and honest, or does it depend on the kid?
Right. I think all of that is true. I think it's a great question to begin with, and something that lots of parents are probably wondering about. Some families and children happen to be more particularly sheltered, and still that doesn't mean that your child will be sheltered forever.
Hmm.
There will come a time when your 15-year-old gets their license and they're able to drive and be out and about independently of parental guidance and parental protection. And so I think the best answer to that is it's really important to find a healthy balance. So a balance means that we can't always shelter and protect our children from all of the unpleasant things that are happening in the world. And so there needs to be, at a certain point in time, a time where we make them aware of what's happening in the world for their own well-being, for their own awareness. And at the same time, even when children have already been exposed to violence for one reason or another, it's still really important to make sure that children are aware that that's not the only thing that the world has to offer. And it's not the only thing that's happening in the world. It's also not the only thing that their future has to offer. So that means when these things happen, and fortunately they do happen more often than we'd like to believe or think about, it's also important to balance out that exposure to violence, to exposure to peace, and exposure to joy, and exposure to relaxation, and not feeling as if they have to be worried about what's happening from one moment to the next. And I really think that's particularly important because, how we expose our children now is really going to impact the way they think about the world in the future. And eventually these children are going to be adults. They're going to be change makers. They're going to be the people who make decisions in the world about exactly how we handle these types of big problems.
I think that's such great advice to think about in terms of balance. So no matter where you are in the continuum of exposure, it's really important to balance your experiences. And so the kids that maybe are more sheltered as they get older, to make sure that they know what's out there. But then also the kids that have had some really terrible experiences, to open their world and make sure that they know that there's good stuff out there too. And I also think that's something tangible that adults and educators can work with. It's like, okay, I know where my child is, or I have an idea. Now I can try to provide them with some balance.
Right.
So when you are talking to kids about gun violence specifically, how should you go about doing that? And I guess let's talk about that in maybe different developmental stages, because obviously how you might have this conversation with an elementary school student would be very different than how you would have this conversation with a high schooler.
True, absolutely. So I think for all children, regardless of their age and developmental level, what's important for them to know is that the adults and grown-ups in charge are always trying their very best to keep them safe and to keep their environment safe. And for older children, those who are more independent and moving about the community independently, it's important for them to understand when it's time to come home. I think that's the most basic way of saying it. I think about shelter kids sometimes and not really understanding how a situation can escalate And so they can be out and about and not realize that a situation that is escalating can quickly become violent.
Hmm.
And that's a simple conversation to have with an older child. Like if a fight starts, you are not a bystander. You need to leave the situation and you need to come home. If there is arguing, if people start looking as if they are ready to become violent, that is your cue to exit the area and bring yourself home. One of the trends that I did also look at recently was that a lot of the gun violence that's happening now is accidental,
Hmm.
and it is involving children more often than
Hmm.
it has been in previous years. And so those type of trends really support the practice of teaching children about safety when it comes to guns and safety in general when it comes to violence that they can be exposed to in the community. And it's really important for us to make sure that we're sort of arming older children with that type of information in a more realistic way, now more than ever.
Yeah, I did note that there's a Washington Post was reporting on a study that said there are, in the past 2 years, there have been more first-time gun buyers than in the recent history. And because of COVID, there haven't been as many gun safety trainings for those adults that are first-time gun owners. So then if you have a family at home and you bring your gun at home, the adults aren't necessarily educated in a way that they know how to handle things safely. So I think
Good point.
that education that needs to span the entire, the entire human population, no matter where you are, or how old you are. And I think that what you said, of really having these conversations, of being aware and knowing your surroundings, and simply taking yourself out of the equation, those are great tips for parents to be able to instruct, certainly their high schoolers who are trying to navigate the world sort of for their first time on their own. So thinking about if you do have a child who is fearful of the world right now, in terms of, there's so many things right now that I think can be a little bit overwhelming for kids, gun violence being one of them, and you're noticing your child is extra anxious, when do you seek professional help for that? When do you or what steps can you take first at home, and then when do you take extra help beyond, to make sure that your child is okay?
That's something that lots of parents kind of wonder about. So I'm glad you asked that question. Well, most parents like to believe, and I think it's true, that we know our children really, really well. So we have a good idea of what type of behaviors are sort of just phases, and what's more normative for our child, even if it's not normative for every child. But when we see these changes and they last for more than a couple of days, then it's a good time to pay close attention to exactly what's happening. So sometimes with this lingering worry also comes changes in behaviors or more fears around activities that children were previously more comfortable with, or maybe even avoidance activities that children previously really enjoyed, like maybe even going to visit grandma or grandpa. That was one of their favorite things to do, and suddenly they have a whole lot more fear around that. Or maybe even just as simple as being able to sleep in their room alone. That was something that they mastered previously, and they have a whole lot more fear around that, to the point that they're not able to do that. So sometimes we might see these changes happen and they only last for short periods of time. And that's more of a normative adjustment period. But parents tend to have a better idea. And typically, a good rule of thumb is if it's lasting more than several days into weeks, that's when you want to pay much closer attention to what's happening. More serious sort of signs and symptoms can be nighttime enuresis or bedwetting at night, and nightmares, or other regression. And when that's happening, it's a good idea to seek professional help right away. And for those parents who just know their children and you just know, we do need to seek professional behavioral help, then it's good to reach out earlier rather than later. Because what tends to happen is that the later we wait, the more challenging the problem can be for our kids.
Mhm, mhm. What are you seeing within your own client base in terms of kids' fears around gun violence? Are you seeing a lot of fear, or do you think it's just all wrapped up with the whole world right now being a little bit more anxious than normal?
I think I've seen a good mixture of it. So there's definitely children that we've worked with who who have had their fair or more than fair share of gun violence exposure, and at times some of them become a lot more fearful, a lot more avoidant of just being out and about and being able to play and relax in their own environment. So that's definitely a real concern, and it's a fear, but it's also a real safety concern that has to be really considered and taken seriously. And so for children like that, of course, we don't want them to stay in the house and not have the ability to play and be out. Then the question becomes, well, where can we go? Like, what environment can we then go to? Is there a Boys and Girls Club near you? Is there someplace else where you would feel more safe and secure being outside just to have some recreation? So those types of fears definitely come up. We also see not just fears, but the other thing that's interesting about trauma exposure is some of the symptoms and results of trauma exposure seem logical, and some seem a little bit illogical. Like, instead of having more fear, there's less inhibition, and there's a shortened sense of future that then leads to less safety behaviors and less preventative behaviors. And that's a real concern.
Hmm.
So that really means that this child or this adolescent has experienced a traumatic event to the extent that they don't see their future as being as long and as fruitful as it really should and can be. And then that in turn impacts their current behaviors.
Mhm.
And in a situation like that, it really is important to make sure that a child is having an opportunity to process what they have experienced with a professional, and to be able to sort of rethink or recreate their own narrative of what it means to have experienced these types of traumas.
Mhm, mhm. What resources might you recommend to a parent who is trying to have these conversations at home, or is starting to think, hey, maybe I need some extra help? Where would you start to direct a parent where to go?
Mhm. Well, really simply stated, sometimes if you happen to be at your child's yearly checkup,
Hmm.
their primary care physician is a great first step and first resource to check in with. Um, Primary care physicians are able to do screeners and to ask the questions that need to be asked to help the family to determine whether or not having further professional support is needed. If a child is in school and there is a school counselor available, then school counselors are wonderful resources and wonderful first steps to help figure out whether or not a child is experiencing the type of events or sequel of events that indicates that another level of treatment is necessary. So really just starting where you are. Some of us have access to just call a professional right away. Not everybody has that access. Some of us have to take extra steps to get referrals. But the important thing is to start where you are and to use the resources that are available to you. And I can't emphasize enough, don't wait. If you know your child and you realize that there's something awry or something that doesn't seem to be correcting itself quickly, then definitely take the steps necessary to reach out and to receive the help that you need.
Mhm. That's really helpful advice. I think sometimes it feels super overwhelming, especially when you have a kid who's really struggling. You're like,
Mhm.
where do I go? But just recommending, hey, go to the places that you know and you're comfortable with
Mhm.
already, and they're incredible resources that you're already using in some capacity. That's a great reminder for parents that hey, like you have the pieces set up already. Just use them. So that's really comforting.
And this is a great time because most of us are taking our kids in for back to school checkups. And these are the types of things that we don't always think we should be checking in with the doctor about, but they should be checking in with your doctor about this too.
Absolutely. I think so often we divorce mental health from physical health, which mental health is so connected and it often
Much
manifests
so.
itself physically. So
Mm.
starting with your pediatrician makes so much sense. Um, so one question that I have been thinking about, because I am a mother of two little ones, how should adults handle when they see their children engaging in play that is around guns? I think it's really common, even if you don't have toy guns,
Mhm.
kids will pick up a stick and they'll engage in violent interactions in some way. And it seems um, sometimes it seems totally developmentally normal and it's like part of processing what it is to be human. And other times it can feel, I think, as a parent, really scary. Are there some tips or tricks you could recommend to parents on how to handle that, both in terms of how to talk to your kids about it when they're little, and then also how parents should cope with sort of our baggage of feelings when it comes around guns and gun violence?
Well, you made a really important point that sometimes this can be serious and sometimes this can just be normative developmental play or a child just sort of mimicking what they saw on television. Even in cartoons, there's usually some violence. And so it's hard to really completely shield your child from any exposure to violence, and children will mimic anything that they see. So it can be lots of different explanations for a child acting out gun violence in play. It can be most certainly a sign of a past trauma exposure. It can be also some level of desensitization to violence, and it can also be just mimicking something that's a little bit more neutral that a child has watched or seen in media or in television. But I agree with you. Sometimes it's hard not to get really, really worried. And sometimes it's for a really good reason that we're getting worried. And sometimes it is our own baggage, our own fear of what this means for our child to be finding ways to use guns in their play or to find ways to somehow simulate violence in their play. And it's not always a reason to worry or to panic. So one response that we may have sometimes is to just take the toys away and say playtime is over, we're not doing this
Hmm.
anymore, because of how we're responding to it and how it triggers us.
Hmm.
And that's one way to do it. They can't play with the toys, they can't do that, right? But it doesn't always solve the problem, and it doesn't always answer the question that will continue to linger for us if we're really concerned about this. So one option could be to take a breath and observe for a moment, and then maybe even asking the child to just tell you, hey, what's happening here, and can you tell me what your toys are doing? Because oftentimes children are just playing out some very more neutral scene that they're familiar with. But it could be something else that they are playing out and processing in their play, because it's normal and it's completely natural for children to play out things that are confusing or upsetting to them as well. So by asking those questions, it gives us the opportunity to get the narrative behind it from the kid, to get an idea of what their explanation is and what their understanding is of what's happening. Once we get that information, then we can make the determination of whether or not we need to intervene and maybe do some corrective measures, or if it's a more serious situation, seek additional help.
Mhm. Would you say that that's a great or a possible way to start that conversation, especially with little kids around gun violence, whether it's happening, you're seeing it through play, or as you mentioned, even on TV, cartoons, or whatever? Should parents be really taking advantage of those moments to have those conversations about gun violence?
I think so, absolutely. I think that sometimes it's really hard, again, because those conversations are hard for us
Hmm. Mhm.
and hard because we may be afraid of what could come out of your child's mouth, because of course we can't predict what might come out of a child's mouth. And so that sometimes will give us pause and make it hard for us to start that conversation. But by all means, this could be a great way of getting an idea of exactly what the child is thinking about, but hasn't actually verbalized.
Hmm. Hmm. That's helpful. And I think maybe a good reminder for parents to be brave and take those opportunities when they're there. Do you have any recommendations for resources on how to talk to your kids about gun violence or guns or even violence in general, if that's a tricky subject for parents?
Well, I think the most important thing to start off with is honesty,
Hmm.
but honesty from an age and developmentally appropriate level. So again, like we sort of talked about earlier, honesty in that conversation that you have is going to look different depending on your child's age and their developmental level and basically their needs as well. So a child who's spending a lot more time outside of the home is going to need a different conversation compared to a child who's always in the home and always under your direct supervision.
Hmm. Mhm.
But in general, it's not a great idea to completely shelter children because children are going to have need to have an idea of what's happening out in the world. And basically, this is for their own safety. It's for them to be not just aware, but to be prepared on how to remain safe if they find themselves in situations that can be potentially dangerous. It also, having those conversations with children also helps to shape their understanding of it. Many times when we see these types of coverage of gun violence in the media, people are mistakenly led to believe that this violence only happens in communities of color, and the people who are responsible for this type of violence are brown and Black people, which is not true at all. And so having these honest conversations with your children can help to dispel those myths and help to guide their thinking into a more realistic way of understanding what's happening around them.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, thank you so much to
Oh,
Dr. Abena Brown El Hill Ali, licensed clinical psychologist with Kennedy Krieger and the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress. Thank you also to our viewers and listeners. Make sure that you do visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for local up-to-date information on home health and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in both podcast and video format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.